Todd Jacobson from the Board of Directors, Treasurer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the 7th Annual Educational Symposium at the 142-year-old Educational Center that is Chautauqua Institution. A community that is nonprofit, and it's a center that's dedicated to promoting the arts and the humanities studies. As a member of the Board of Directors, I will tell you that we are delighted to offer and to see both our staff and those outside the Resource Center here, gathering to enhance our knowledge today in various aspects of our field. In past years, we've had a summer conference here at Chautauqua, usually during the season, and then a fall educational symposium. This year we wanted to combine the two, making things less complicated because it's not during the season, and we just hope you have a wonderful time here today. We have great speakers and engaging speakers for you today. We will be breaking up later, and Heather will tell all how that happens. I believe it promises to be a great day of learning for everybody. And I'd like now to call forward Heather Brown, our Assistant Executive Director of TRC, for introductions and to start our symposium. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, what a wonderful crowd this morning. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to start with just a few housekeeping so everybody kind of knows the lay of the land and how the day is going to go, and then I'll introduce our keynote and we'll be well on our way. After the keynote session, there's going to be 3 breakout sessions, and then each session has 3 different choices. You'll find the rooms. Room number 1 is right over here to the right. The room number 2 and room number 3, you also will be proceeding through that room, but you'll be going downstairs. There's an elevator right by the stairway, and the speakers will be down there and help guide it with the room facilitators. Everybody just do a double check on your cell phone. And on the tables, you'll see surveys. We're going to want those filled out at the end of the day. The lunch will be served in this room, and again, you'll convene back into this room for the closing address with Kevin Hines. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce and have the distinct pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for today's educational symposium. I've had the opportunity to hear Hans Meissner speak at numerous conferences and also work with him during the very first Learning Institute several years ago. And let me tell you, we're in for a big treat today. Hans currently is the CEO of the Arca Rensselaer in Troy, New York, where he's worked to promote the inclusion of persons with disabilities in all aspects of community life since 1979. Hans is a thought leader in promoting social innovation at the state, local, national, and international levels. Over the years, he's assumed leadership roles with both the National and the New York State Rehab Association and Partners of America. He has a PhD in organizational development and is an independent consultant in management person-centered approaches. He works with strategic planning, team building, conflict resolution, leadership, and management training. Additionally, he's been an academic director at Antioch Graduate School in the Department of Organization and Management and has taught at Sage Graduate School in the Doctoral Nursing Leadership Program. Dr. Meissner is published in the Journal of Intellectual Disabilities and has a book called Creating Blue Spaces, Fostering Innovative Support Practices for People with Developmental Disabilities. Welcome, Dr. Meissner, to create some blue spaces for us this morning.
Can you hear me back there all right? Yeah. You all right? All right, I'll just shout at you. An hour and a half, just scream at you. No, I try not to scream hysterically. Creating Blue Spaces was born out of my utter confusion about life in working in the field of developmental disabilities. Just trying to make sense of our current ways of doing supporting people with disabilities and where I've come from and where we're going. And also working with a bunch of people internally to the Arc of Rensselaer County. And many of these concepts will also develop that I'm going to show you today in terms of helping leadership and OBWDD understand where we're going in the future. Creating Blue Space is about looking at the question of how best to support people with developmental disabilities. This has been a a significant problem, question for society, at least in America, in an organized way since the 1940s. So before then, it was really informal, maybe not even a question that surfaced in general. But back in the 1940s, as we know, that question was answered in the form of institutions. Let's create these idyllic institutions and idyllic places throughout New York State. Of course, throughout the country it occurred, but New York State, doing everything as bigger than everybody else, managed to get the most mileage out of that form of support. So trying to understand, answering that essential question really relates back to, so what do we assume about people with developmental disabilities? What do we assume about our relationship with people with developmental disabilities? And what are the kinds of outcomes we hope to achieve by supporting a person that has a developmental disability? So when we're looking at this today, that's the set of questions that I'm going to try to make some sense out for you. But I do want to hopefully locate some of how you're listening to me through your own lens and sort of turn so that the camera away from me, because I'm not really the expert, I'm one of you. I'm just trying to make sense out of all this confusion as well. And turn it back on yourself and try to figure out what got you in the room today. And why are you struggling with that question today? And bringing it back to my own personal experience, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in grade schools, in the middle schools, and in high schools, not experiencing anybody with a developmental disability. There was nobody in my world that had a developmental disability. At some time, I think in the latter 60s, I got a hall pass to take care of my own business, and I noticed that there was a group of people that looked different than some other people I knew at my high school, being shuffled through the hallway to some unknown place within the high school. I never got the answer, and nobody answered my question about who those people were and where they were going or what was happening with those people. But now I can look back in retrospect and know that those were probably people labeled as developmentally disabled. It was probably one of the first special classrooms in that high school. It's probably thought to be progressive. The beginnings of the 1970s, right? In 1960, 1970, there were no laws that said people needed to be integrated or served in school settings. And so there I was, really not having one experience with a person with developmental disabilities. Now my background was also, my parents were immigrants from I was going to say New Jersey. We lived in New Jersey. That would be interesting. We know that we might not want those people here. But I'm confessing that's where I grew up partially. Anyway, they were immigrants from Germany. My father was a Jewish immigrant from New Jersey. He was born and raised in Berlin and had to escape. His family had to escape. Some of them didn't escape the Holocaust. So that experience, that wrenching experience for my parents in terms of the war, in terms of persecution, in terms of discrimination, in terms of losing your roots, permeated the household. I grew up passionate about social change, about that not happening to other people. I just didn't have a place in which to lodge those interests, that energy. And so it really came later, and it came with people when I began to understand the plight of people with developmental disabilities in institutional settings. That became where I sort of began to hook my interest and my purpose in life. And I think this is what I'm trying to get you to think about today is, what is your higher purpose in life, especially around this work? And the reason why I think that's important is because we exist within a very turbulent and tough environment. Now certainly there's a lot of money out there, but what we have to do to get it is very problematic in terms of figuring out how to support people with developmental disabilities in a way that supports their citizenship in our communities. So that's the set. I want you to think about it through that lens. So off of this fuzzy overhead to the next one. So Creating Blue Space, the book, is really through the lens of me and the arc of Rensselaer County. So that's our experience. That's something I know about. You would put your own experience in there, but I think you can relate to what I'm going to be talking about. So it's a narrative. This is the basic question formulation of the book. Our experience is of a world of turbulent and intense conflict and unsustainable systems. Now probably, in some conference, you probably had somebody up here with a PowerPoint presentation talking to you about how unsustainable our system is, both financially and workforce-wise. I'm not going to do that. We already know about that. We know that's our world. Not only is it an unsustainable system, financially and maybe even enough support providers, but there's a frustration that is occurring around social inclusion and full citizenship. And we can only see that really at this part in our journey. We're sort of at a vantage point where we can now see and now reach, which is kind of the hopeful statement, towards this dream of full inclusion in our communities of all those people, including people with developmental disabilities that have been marginalized from the centerpiece of our life. So we are frustrated though, because we feel a little bit stuck. How do we make that next step? So in the context of increasing regulations, control, oversight, paperwork, cost-cutting that restrict social action and innovation, there are calls for transformation. And we sort of feel that contradiction on a daily basis. Now, in order to make sense out of this, I'm thinking, this is a tough environment. What does that actually mean? What does that mean for us as individuals? And I remember at one point, I was watching a Bill Moyers expose on a conference similar to this, probably similar setting, in which he had there were a number of speakers talking about the subject called facing evil. One of those speakers was Maya Angelou, and I think you can still get at least the clip of Maya talking about that subject, which is really super powerful. I suggest it to you in YouTube. You can't get the whole thing anymore, I don't think, the whole 2-hour presentation. But one of the other people that was talking was a guy named Philip Halley. He was a philosopher. He passed away in 1994, so this particular conference was probably in the latter 80s. And he was speaking to this question of facing evil. He had gone to Europe during World War II as part of an artillery operation, extension of the U.S. Army. And his job was to, fire these big guns into German towns, and then later on, as part of a crew, go in there and clean up what was ever left. And the particular missiles that were fired into towns were called phosphorus bombs. And they were pretty nasty things. They would blow people up, but not fully. You just have parts hanging out. So he would come through the town, and there were young German soldiers just with their heads looking up at the sky. And this image haunted him. He thought, this is just horrible. How can I live with this image in my mind? And after the war, he became a search. He started searching for places in which people were actually doing good things rather than blowing people up. And he found somebody who knew about a town in France during the war called Chambon, in which this town, with all its energies, had saved 4,000 women and children who were running from the Holocaust. They were Jewish, and they had protected them. And this was in the middle of the occupation of the Nazis. And so he was thinking, like, how did that happen? How did this little small town figure out a way of doing this covert operation under the nose of the Nazis? How did they disarm them literally as pacifists. And he didn't come up with any particular answers to that question, but he did know that there were good people doing good things amongst all this craziness, all this storming craziness and turbulence that was happening during that time period. And he then began to see that there was a metaphor for life in that story. And that metaphor was the metaphor of the hurricane, which he thought was pretty much our life existence, which says there's a lot of destruction and craziness out there in the universe. But in the center, there's blue space. There's space for life and life-giving and good things to happen. And he then said, our imperative as human beings was to create more blue space. Even though that storm would never really go away, every day that would be our mission. So that's where I get creating blue space. Then I turn it around here. And so in the calm is life-sustaining place. And the quote I love is, in a world of moral hurricanes, some people can and do carve out rather large ethical spaces. So that's what I'm trying to advocate for every day of my life, is to figure out how I can do that within myself, so I can create, even though I get pretty angry about some of the things that are happening in our communities, some of the things that are happening when the government just forces regulation down our throats and then constrains good things to happen. The anger that I see in organizations that aren't friendly to their employees and so forth. That these blue spaces can happen inside myself, so I can act in a particular way, in a moral way. And these spaces can happen in a relationship between the people we live with, the people we care about. These can happen in our organizations, in which we can create some space for us to work together in super positive ways. And I also advocate that with our relationship with those funders that we feel are over-regulating us. So why is this story important? Well, first of all, I think the narrative doesn't flinch away that we have a tough challenge that we're forced with. If we're at the point that we can actually see that people with developmental disabilities can take their role in our families, in our communities, in our school, in our religious and spiritual places, in jobs, and so forth, we also know that at the same time, the conditions to make that happen are very difficult. We see the gap. We also invite you to participate, even though it's that tough, to find a way to create that space for that to happen. And then, well, I just said that, so I'll go on that. I don't think you can see this all the way back there, so I'm trying to navigate this for you. I think that in spite of all these challenges, we have some great examples of people who actually are playing out those citizenship roles in our community. I know that at least I talked to some people at the Resource Center last night. It is happening. You have some wonderful examples of people who have some really unique individualized supports that are getting some great outcomes in the community. So I think in spite of all the craziness, you are doing it. So this is what I hope to realize in my life. I believe on some level that I came to work in the field back in the 1970s. This is how I got attached after seeing nobody with a developmental disability. I was up in the Adirondacks, and I was working at Eastern Mountain Sports at that time, very small, boutique type of backpacking store. And I had a sort of a 10-hour day every day, and I had a couple of days off, and I thought, well, why not volunteer? And I ended up volunteering at the Essex ARC, which is now called Mountain Life Service. And I really didn't know what a person with developmental disability was like, or how they experienced life. And at that point, I volunteered. They hooked me up with somebody named Joan. Joan didn't really talk. She was nonverbal, but we developed a really cool relationship. And I began to relate to somebody on a different level rather than just verbally. So this sort of turned me on to the potential of working with people and improving their life, and this sort of met my energy around social change. I went back to school, got a degree in rehab counseling, and then right around that time, at that same time, deinstitutionalization started accelerating. So you began to get a lot of development around community settings, and we now think of in terms, we label them as legacies, legacy organizations. Some people were offended by that term. I kind of like that term because it's a gift. It really is a gift for that period of time. That's what we saw. Institutions had devolved into very abusive settings. The organizations that most of us are employed in began developing community residences or shelter workshops or day programs or group day programs. Those were the best thing we could see at that vantage point at that point in that journey, that evolutionary journey. And we are now at a different point in our evolution journey. We're sort of on a bridge. We've crossed away from kind of the land of hell, which the institutional life was, and we're now beginning to see some potential on the other side. So I've seen this as a crossing the bridge kind of experience. I like to label my experience, and perhaps your experience in terms of working in this field, as a hero's journey. And the hero's journey is really a typical or templated experience of people who have had profound changes happen in their life and have had profound influences, insights into new ways of looking and living life. And Joseph Campbell was the person who had looked at different religions and different stories and narratives about heroes in numerous cultures, and had discovered there was a typical pathway that occurred. Usually there was some form of connection with a person that wasn't really asking to do much of anything. And they would get surprised that they were now on this journey in a land they didn't understand. And they went through trials and tribulations. And at the end of those trials and tribulations, they began to have a new way of looking at the world, an insight, or a new set of capacities. And that those set of capacities then could be brought back to a community, and the community could be enriched by those. So this is a typical pattern that you see in the hero's journey. Now some people actually have a calling that you can think of. Like I had a calling around social change. It was my life circumstance. It called to me to actually help people relate to each other that were different from one another. And again, so it so happened it was in this area that I was working. So you have some form of calling, right, that then brings you into situations that breaks you away from your typical life circumstance, breaking away from routines. And now you're sort of off the pathway of, the one that you take every day, and you're seeing something different. You move into new territories, you see different things, you can empathize with different experiences, and you begin to have a new perspective. This leads to you letting go of the roles that you have now and seeing different possibilities after you reconnect to a higher purpose or a deeper purpose in life. That's there, but you have to listen to it. And then you begin to vision and have something new surface for you or your organization, and then you try something out, given that vision, and then you integrate it in practice. Now, we just talked about the Learning Institute, and the Learning Institute actually was designed on this experience here. It was interested in taking a cohort of people through the experience of the hero's journey. And we can have numerous hero's journeys. We sort of use the U-shape because it takes you deep, ultimately deep into yourself by disrupting your current way of looking at things and your purposes. And then it resurfaces into action. And that's why they describe the U. which is what many people, how many innovators describe their experience. So, this is a question at your table. I'd like you to think about it for a second, and then talk about it at your table, so you don't have to listen to me for an hour and a half. And here's some of the things that might motivate you. And what I would like you to do is sort of, in your mind, order those. There might be, you might say, all those things motivate me to work with people with developmental disabilities towards this inclusion agenda. So, but you might say, but this is the one that really gets me. This is why I get up every day. So, one could be your mission, your agency's mission turns you on. And that's what drives you. It calls to you, so to speak. Another aspect would be that the new CMS community guidelines have kicked you into action. Why are you laughing? There are some people out there. I mean, you know, if you look at conferences, they're very telling in terms of you know, what brings people to the conference. I'm glad you're here today, so I'm hoping this inspirational stuff grabs you even deeper. But when managed care was starting to look like something we were doing for the field of developmental disabilities, all the conferences were about managed care, and they were about how to reposition your organization for managed care. And they got a lot of people, so obviously a lot of people are motivated by this kind of stuff. So, you know, check out your brochures. It might say, you know, how to implement the CMS community rule. And watch how many people show up. See if a lot of people show up. Another one would be the negative press. This never happens, right, in New York State. There are people who get really, you know, oh, I better respond to what's happening in the press. Now, it could also, conversely, just anger you and motivate you in a different way. How about a threat of audit? We don't have any audits there, so we don't get motivated by that. How about the interests of people that you're supporting and family members? Does that motivate you? How about your own personal commitment to social change? Now, I've got to admit that that was how I entered that journey. And now, certainly, all the other pieces here have some motivational component to it. But, for example, this is really motivating for me to set up a corporate compliance system and do 100% audits in my organization. But it also is horribly demotivating after a while. There's a point at which I hit a wall with that, and I begin falling into despair. I don't know about you guys, but that's where the hurricane and storm, it's not my blue space, I'll tell you that much. So I have to go back down and reconnect with that piece. Now, which was cool was that that social change agenda sort of coupled with the interest of individuals and families. It was by personalizing the experience that it really got me. I mean, because I had a personal commitment to social change, but I was kind of like, where do I show up with this? And when I connected with this one, that really keyed me in. Now, you could say then after that, what happened is that I then got turned on by the mission of the ARC of Rensselaer County. And prior to that, it was Mountain Lake Services. I really liked the organization. I liked what they had to say. I liked their energy around the mission. Then, of course, all that other crap comes in. So why don't we take a few minutes and you guys connect your personal story to these motivations. See where you're at with this at this point. I'll check in with you in 5 or so, 10 minutes, and we'll come back together. How's that sound?
It sounds really cool, doesn't it? It's not.
Martina's been the lead for 6 years. Oh, goodness, I wish. It's been a long time. Actually, there's an extra spot right here.
There's two.
Yeah, can you see? Yeah.
Find another chair.
At least sitting here.
Things may happen when you do.
Okay, let's see. Randy, who's coming in? Signed it? Yeah, we're all signed up. We were sitting in the back.
like to think, we really are doing something
Hello, everybody. We'll start instead of shouting to get your attention. So we can transition back, but we do have a phone for sale and glasses for sale. If, I mean, I think somebody left this in the men's room.
Should see me. I'm assuming it's a man.
I hope you all realize through this exercise that all this stuff is some of you might have said, and I did hear at this table, that a lot of your day is thinking about how you're going to document the service and not get slammed by Omega or somebody. Or making sure those check boxes are done. So the world, it seems, at least in that circumstance, with some of your experience on a daily basis, is just filled up with this kind of detail stuff, which is around transaction of billable service. You got to make sure that like 200 things are filled out correctly, and if you didn't sign it within within a particular 30-day period, all those 199 elements, it doesn't matter if they're there because that last element you missed. So a lot of us are thinking about that, and it fills up that whole container completely. And is there room for it? And this is really a struggle. And somebody sent this to me today, and it was just so appropriate an email. I just thought, geez, it's really a struggle sometimes. And this is the quote, I think it's pretty good. Yes, and still we're called to struggle, not because it assures us victory, but because it assures us an honorable and sane life. So somehow how to remain grounded in this craziness is what I'm talking about when we have to create blue space. So just a thought, and I, of course, left. I just discovered over here that I have a bunch of people that are immigrants from New Jersey. and confirm my experience. So try to think about this as this is all personal. One of the things that confuse and confound us, remember I'm trying to make sense of all this craziness, is that we now know that we are in the middle of reforming healthcare, right? Right, aren't we, in New York? I mean, I know you had Jason Elders in there at some point. Now, if he was like over there listening to me, he'd be talking about reforming healthcare and bending back the cost curve. That's what you would hear him say. Then you'd have me on this side going, but we have to support real lives, inclusive. And you're like stuck in the middle, right? What is this? This is what we call a competing commitment. These are two legitimate goals, but sort of are in tension with one another. And in some level, one gets in the way of the other. And our chore is to sort of figure this stuff out. Another person had coined the term, this is what we know as a wicked question. Wicked meaning there's no real answer to it. I'm not going to give you the answer in an hour and a half presentation. Even if I was here all week, which would probably shoot me at the end of the week, you would not get the answer to this question. It's about engaging the tension and working it through, getting to the next vantage point and seeing, oh, that's the adaptive move we can make. There's no strategic plan that moves you forward on this competing commitment. They're only what is known as adaptive moves, whole new philosophy on how to manage organizations. So you get, okay, let's get into a room and figure out how we're going to deal with these tensions today. That'll bring us to a next point in our journey, and then we'll be able to see maybe a little bit further down the road, and we'll try this adaptive movie. So that's how I would suggest that. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Sophie's Choice, I don't know if some of you in the room might remember that Meryl Streep movie from many, many moons ago, 30 years ago, where Meryl Streep was, I believe, a Jew in World War II, around the Nazi time period, and had to choose between her children in terms of who was going to go to a concentration camp. That's what Sophie's Choice was about. It formulated her psychology throughout the rest of the film. So you see, Sophie's Choice for us is, do we create a new business model, which is the new language, the new jargon. Everybody says, when you say, well, what are we going to do about supported employment? And the generic response is, you got to create a new business model. Of course, it's based on all sorts of horrible assumptions for business. Like, we don't change our price or rate, we don't have any control over it, we don't have any control over how we allocate our money internally. It's all dictated to us by CFRs and so forth. So trying to create a new business model under a highly constrained environment is very tough for providers. The other question is, are we really talking about social innovation, which is, you can see that's where I'm sort of leaning towards. Social innovation is really about changing how we interact with one another, switching around roles, trying out new different things in our communities. It's a whole different thing. It's not a business model. It's about changing the nature of how we relate together in our communities. And so when on one level you have all this language in healthcare that, you know, if you go to the Positioning Yourself in Managed Care conference, you're going to hear covered lives, rate rationalization, metrics and analytics, allowable services, and so forth. And on this side, you're going to hear, which is building inclusive communities, deep listening practices, realigning relationships with individuals and families, learning organizations, co-designing and co-implementing the supports, and so forth, right? Now, the interesting thing about healthcare reform is it attempts to tell you that they can do these kinds of things, but it's really a whole different sensibility. So this is your nice turbulent storm and stuck place that you're at. You're between these two tensions. We even have CMS sort of playing out these two tensions. On one hand, they're saying the community guidelines got to help people have inclusive lives, and on the other hand, they're saying you got to change your billing practices to every 15 minutes, which is really in this area. So we have this horrible contradiction going on. I don't know how to resolve that, folks. I just think that we have to acknowledge that that is, we're in the middle of that. What was Tom Peters once said? It said, if you're not confused, you're not really listening. Which is the best thing he ever said. So I also like riffing on the term paradigm. You know, people are saying, oh, there's a paradigm shift happening in our world, right? That's an overused term. Well, did you know the guy who coined that term was a guy named Thomas Kuhn, who was talking about completely different ways of relating to the world, different world views. And he would say, if you're operating currently in a particular paradigm, you cannot see another paradigm, and you cannot change it. There's sort of a tipping point that occurs at some point where a critical mass of people in society switch to a different way of thinking and looking at things. But you can't say today, I'm going to go learn a new paradigm. It's not the same thing. So unfortunately, when somebody says, well, you just got to shift your paradigm, it's not easy for you to say. I don't think anybody has ever shifted their paradigm, except these guys. And they look like they might have been drinking too much. Anyway, in terms of the Arc of Rensselaer County, we're much like you guys, struggling with trying to make it work. But I think we had some help. When I joined the organization back in the early 80s, actually the latter 70s, early 80s, we had a founder of that organization named Henrietta Meissner, and her cohort, central cohorts on the board, that were very passionate about the concept of small is beautiful. And she really believed in community. She did not believe in medicalizing services, so she was, and I know that many people went to the ICF model at that point in time. They rejected the model because of how it infused medical supports in sort of an overkill way early on. And so, although I do think we eventually knew that there was a value of clinic services, I don't want to diss clinicians. But the idea that the whole model was focused around and through a medical lens, she saw as problematic. So we never got into big residences. They also did not believe in anything big. So even though we had started a shelter workshop and we were getting bigger and bigger in terms of more people coming in, we were like, well, now it's time to put on an addition or get a bigger building. And she said, and her cohort said, that ain't going to happen. You're not getting bigger. And so that forced our organization into sort of a mode, an alternative pathway. Remember that call to action? I had one call to action. That was my second call to action, was how do we not get a big program model as the way we do business. And so that sort of disrupted my routine, because I was just like everybody else professionally saying, well, we got to get our shelter workshop bigger, we got to get this bigger, that bigger. And now I'm having a key board member and leader saying, no, you're not going to do that. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That caused me to go out on another journey of trying to figure out who was doing things differently in the universe. We discovered some of those people over the years. Residentially what we did was we began looking, we had about, back in this time period, which was 1988, we had about 80 people in group homes. And remember, none of them were really any bigger than 8-person, and many of them eventually became smaller than that, but they were still group homes. At that particular time, now fast forward into 2015 and 16, you have now about 38 people in group homes. So something happened between those time periods in an organization, and that was that we closed 6 residences and began to move people out. Now, as you can imagine, that wasn't CMS telling us to do that, nor was it OPWDD or OMRDD at that time. So there was something in the culture of the organization that moved us into that place back then. And we also, which was atypical from the early 80s, never put 2 people in a bedroom, which at this point you might look back and say, well, big deal. But back then it was a big deal. That was your financial model, that you had 2 people in bedrooms. And so adults sharing bedrooms. That's some big changes for us. Then there was a small time period, we developed a few residences, homes that were like 3 or 4 people in a particular home. And you can see that there were, at one point, there was about 22 people. Now there's about 15 people in those type of homes. So we reduced the size of them. What was markedly different is that we had a few people in apartments back in '88, maybe 18 people. But you can see now we got over 100 people in their own place. So it's a big change, big shift over the years, but it was over the years. But you can see it was also a concerted effort. First, no sharing of bedrooms and no ICFs. Then it was close, bigger homes. Then it was open, no group homes. And then it's now only develop your own place. So this was, I think, a really concerted effort towards evolution and different ways of relating to people and supporting housing. So I think we have some credential in that area, some practice in that area. We feel pretty good about it. And so far, so good. So, lessons we've learned so far in doing things like that. One would be we have to think differently about people and how they're supported. The concept of safety is different. The concept of community is different. The concept of failure is different. For example, we might have a really highly creative relationship with a family and individual, and all sorts of cool things are happening, and then something happens within the family and it falls apart, like some of our families fall apart. And what we do next is not get more conservative. We don't go, oh, did you see what just happened? Now we got to go back to group homes. What we see is that it happened for that person, but we're not generalizing it. Now we're now kicking in a policy about people in that kind of creative situation. So I think that's a different way of thinking about safety. The old way of thinking, or maybe the legacy way of thinking, is that you get more controlling. You put more controls in place. I caution about that. Doesn't mean we're reckless. We're not reckless at all. So the change begins with you, as I mentioned. If you're going to do this work, because nobody's going to help you. I mean, OPWDD's not helping you with this stuff. They're not making life easy for you. And CMS is giving you the community rules, but they've also given you a whole lot of other crap. So, I mean, nobody's making this easy for you, so you better think about what it means for yourself.